Okay, continuing with components of a typical structure of government, we have the third component would be the assembly, again a generic term, based intentionally, I think, on the House of Commons, which is the lower house of the British Parliament, an institution that had been developing since the 13th century. Um, that's where the power was. Each of the 13 colonies had one. The members were elected by the landowners, and it could it could pass laws. It would set the tax rate. It would vote the salary, the pay of everybody who was on the colony's payroll, including the governor. So that's where the power was. So here we have a three-part structure. You have a chief executive called the governor. You have an advisory body called the council, and that's going to evolve into the upper house of a two-house legislature. That's a little bit of a stretch to call it one as it existed during colonial times. And then you have the assembly. So that structure should look familiar. Check out America today. All 50 states are headed by a governor. 49 of the 50 states, with Nebraska being the exception, have a bicameral or two-house legislature where the members of the upper house, we use the terms upper and lower without blushing. The upper house, they serve. There are fewer of them. They serve shorter terms, and they have more prestige. The members of the lower house are greater in number. They serve shorter terms. They have less prestige, but technically they're supposed to initiate all legislation having to do with money, that is, taxing or spending. Texas is as good an example as any. Texas has a Senate and a House of Representatives. The Senate has 31 members who serve 4-year terms. The Texas House of Representatives has 150 members who serve 2-year terms. The governor used to serve a 2-year term until just over 40 years ago. In the 1970s, we changed that, where the governor was elected only every 4 years in years offset from presidential election years. Okay. Now, think about our national government. This does not include the judicial branch, just the executive and legislature, but the president is a kind of national governor. And we have a two-house Congress. The upper house is the Senate, which has 100 members, 2 from each state. They serve 6-year terms. The election years are staggered so that in a given state, the 2 senators will not be elected in the same year. And for the United States Senate as a whole, only no more than 33 or occasionally 34 seats are up for election in any one election year. Okay? And they have considerable prestige. You know, presidents come and presidents go, but senators can hang around for a long time. Okay? And they represent the states as equal political entities. That's why California, which has nearly 40 million people, they have 2 senators, and Wyoming, which has a population less than that of the city of Fort Worth, has 2 senators. By the way, if Tarrant County had been a state in 2010, it would have ranked 39th in population. Okay? And the House of Representatives typically has exclusive power to initiate all taxing and spending legislation. I don't know for sure that they are fastidious about that up there anymore. They let go a lot of things. So there you have the structure. There's only one more thing to throw on top of this, and that is that by the middle of the 18th century, colonies, we're back to the colonies now, colonies would employ what we would call today lobbyists, known as colonial agents. The government of a colony might hire actually an Englishman who lived in London to serve as their agent and plead their case, to try to protect their interests in the British government as it became necessary. Benjamin Franklin, you've heard of him. He actually lived in London for about 10 years leading up to the time of the American Revolution, and he was the official agent for several different colonies at the same time. Apparently, he's pretty good at it. And I'm going to tell you later what caused him to come back home and act against England. He was prime and situated very well just to stay over there and be a Tory when the revolution broke out. He didn't. Okay, that's going to take care of it for the structure of government question. We proceed now to the imperial administration question. Whereas structure of government outlines very neatly. It's very neat and pretty consistent among the colonies. This next one, if you get the impression that this is sort of freewheeling and loose and unsystematic and just making it up as they went along, then hey, you got it right, because that's what it was. As Americans, sadly, we need to find our way back home on this. We seem to just take it for granted that the government will regulate everything. If it moves, regulate it, or tax it, or both. So it's kind of hard to understand that the British government didn't exactly run its empire the way we would expect such a thing to be. I should tell you that none of the colonies were government projects. They weren't. This was free enterprise, private sector all the way. Various kings in the 17th century and one in the 18th granted charters authorizing people to establish colonies on land that came with the charter. Once that's done, and by the way, it's the king's project. The king did this, and the colonies were the king's deal administratively. Parliament, until late in the colonial period, it's part of the government of England, not so much a part of the government of the empire. Kind of keep that distinction in mind. But once the king is granted the charter, it's as if his part of it is over, and the colonies were then just left to run themselves. So England never, I'm tempted to say they never really evolved a consistent colonial policy. They did in a way. I don't know how consistent it was, but let me just put it this way. The English government, king or parliament or whoever, there was only one thing about the colonies that mattered to them, and that was economics. That was commerce and trade, and England making money off the colonies. That's all they cared about. They didn't care about anything else. So for anything other than economics, and yes, I know that's a lot, the colonies had free play. They could make their own laws, they could set their own taxes, they could do it pretty much however they wanted to, as long as they're in compliance with a growing list of economic regulations. So they were accustomed to that. Plus, if they needed it, they had the protection of the British Navy, and I would say the British Army, but I can't look you in the eye and tell you that the British Army came over here until not that long before the Revolution broke out. So it's quite unsystematic. And there's the closest they came to having a policy was an odd accumulation of trade regulations known collectively as the Navigation Acts. I posted an article about that at the Canvas site under this week. The navigation laws, or the Navigation Acts, began in 1651 to counter a situation where the Dutch had grown very powerful in international trade, and they were getting rich carrying stuff back and forth between England and its own colonies. And so a parliament, which was not technically legal because it was the period between the reigns, they passed the first navigation law, which required that all of this trade be carried in English ships and that the crews had to be at least 75% English and on from there. Plus, certain goods could only be carried to the colonies from England, not from anywhere else. And there are certain colonial products that could only be marketed in England and not anywhere else. At least that's the form it eventually took. So, as soon as the monarchy was restored in 1660, they immediately passed this act again, made it legal, and they added to it down through the years. So its purpose was to maintain the mercantile system. Granted, they hadn't really analyzed that or given it a name yet, but that's what it amounts to. Just to make sure that the colonies played their assigned role in that system of being suppliers of raw materials and exotics, a term which means things that could not be produced in England, to the mother country, and then to consume manufactured goods from the mother country, thereby guaranteeing England a positive balance of trade. Now, that carried the seeds of its own destruction. I'm just foreshadowing something for the next unit here, because if England has a positive balance of trade and the colonies can't really trade much outside the British Empire, then they are going to have a negative balance of trade, and they're not going to have a way to generate the funds to pay back the debt that's going to balloon, but that they owe to British merchants. That'll make more sense later. Okay. The closest they had in the English government to an agency that had oversight on this was something known from the 1690s on as the Board of Trade. It was originally established in the 1660s during the reign of Charles II. In those days, the way they had it set up, the king still had actual personal power, and there was a body of advisors to the king. They served the king, known as the Privy Council. There was a committee of the Privy Council set up in the 1660s called the Lords of Trade, and they're supposed to, I guess, keep an eye on the colonies and recommend any kind of trade legislation that might strike them as needful. The big reorganization came in the 1690s. The Lords of Trade became the Board of Trade, and so we take it from there. The Board of Trade, like much of the rest of the English government, ran on a form of what's the word? Corruption. It was, you served on it by appointment. You got paid for serving on it. You didn't necessarily have to do anything. And I've read accounts of this that are kind of all up and down the spectrum. Some say, oh, they're hardworking and dedicated. Others say, they didn't know much about what they're supposed to do and cared a whole lot less. And the only person that had actual power was the professional secretary of the Board of Trade. But what it came down to is it only did, get in front of the camera here, two things. One, it nominated governors for royal colonies. If there's a vacancy in the governorship of a royal colony, the Board of Trade will pick somebody, all right, probably to pay some political debt. And that choice will invariably be just rubber stamped up the chain of command, and there you go. The other thing they did was that they had final say over all the laws passed by colonial assemblies. I suspect that just means the royal colonies. It could have been the others as well. I'm not completely sure. But a law passed by a colonial assembly, the council doesn't object, the governor doesn't object, still can't be put into effect until they've shipped a copy of it over to England, where it gets on the agenda of the Board of Trade, and they eventually read it, they eventually talk about it, they eventually vote on whether to allow it or disallow it. They allowed about 95% of the ones they reviewed, but you never knew what they're going to do, because what they do today has nothing to do with what they did last time. So, and it could take at least 2, maybe as long as 5 years to get something done. So it's a neat place to stop. We'll take up for the rest of this in a minute.